Hello everybody, and welcome to my Theros Beyond Death Draft Guide 2.0. It has been a couple of months since my last draft guide for Theros Beyond Death, so I wanted to update the old guide, show you all of the stuff I've learned, and keep you updated on how to dominate in this format. But before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy this video and want to help me out, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content, and leave a comment in the comment section down below if you do have any questions or feedback. I really love hearing from you folks and answering your questions. But without further ado, let's dive into the guide. So what are we going to cover in this guide? We're going to go through the new top 3 commons by each color. We are going to go through the new color rankings, the new archetypes overview, and we are going to go through the biggest movers up and the biggest movers down since the time of my last guide. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Okie doke, so these were the top 3 commons I had for white at the beginning of the set. There has not been a huge amount of movement here. Heliod's Pilgrim has taken over the number 2 slot from Daybreak Chimera, and this is mostly because there's just a ton of aura synergy in this set. In white, you can get Dreadful Apathy or Sentinel's Eyes. In red, if you pair white with red, you can get Iroas's Blessing. If you pair white with green, you can get Warbriar's Blessing. Even things like blue, you can get Ichthyomorphosis or Starlit Mantle. There's just a ton of things. You can get Mogus's Favor in black or Mire's Grasp. That's another massive synergy. There's just tons of synergy with Heliod's Pilgrim throughout all of the colors, and so you're going to want to be taking these early so that you can have more access to your powerful auras later. Daybreak Chimera is still good, though it is a little bit worse than initially estimated, just because you're usually going to be casting this as a 4-mana 3/3 flyer, which, while good, is by no means game-breaking. Moving on to blue, there was a huge shakeup in blue. The top 2 commons are no longer even on the leaderboard and have been replaced by Omen of the Sea and Thirst for Meaning. These are just 2 card draw options that you are always going to want. Omen of the Sea is very cheap. It fits into a lot of the different archetypes. The control decks want it. The blue-red cast cards on your opponent's turn deck wants it. The Constellation decks want it. It really is just a very versatile card and fits with lots of the themes of the set, and so it is just going to be the number 1 blue common because it'll fit into any blue deck you draft, and you'll take as many copies as you can get. Thirst for Meaning, on the other hand, is also very powerful and is a great card advantage tool. Blue decks tend to need card advantage because they are a little bit lacking in the escape department. So cards like Thirst for Meaning let you make up for them that card advantage if you have some useless enchantments to pitch. And then Ichthyomorphosis stays at number 3, still going to be pretty good removal in this format, especially if you are a Flyers deck, so you can kind of ignore the chump blocking ability of the 0/1. Moving on to black. Black doesn't have a huge shakeup because Mire's Grasp and Final Death were relatively easy to pin as the top 2 black commons, but I do have Blightbreath Catablebas getting narrowly edged out by Lampad of Death's Vigil. This card is just a premium black 2-drop. There are 2 other black 2-drops in the set. There is the Temple Thief, and there is the I just know him as the 2/1 that dies into a goat token. It's like the Discordant Piper, that's his name. But Lampad of Death's Vigil is really the premium black 2-drop that you're looking for. It's subtly powerful, having all of your opponent's removal spells turned into essentially you draining them for 1 and you gaining life, especially because some of the removal spells are exile based, and Lampad lets you save your creatures that have escape to fight another day, which is just very powerful. So Lampad of Death's Vigil is a black common that maybe doesn't look absurd, but is definitely very powerful and one that you're going to want as many copies as you can get. I think after 3 copies or 2 copies it gets a little bit worse, but you generally aren't going to be worried if you have 2 copies of Lampad in your pile. It's a very good card. Moving on to the red commons, there's only a little bit of movement here. I have Incendiary Oracle replaced by Final Flare. I have been steadily more and more impressed by Final Flare, enough that I have bumped it into the top 3 commons. It works particularly well if you are prioritizing the omens, because Final Flare can sacrifice those omens and deal damage to your opponent's creatures. You don't get the scry benefit, but you don't really have to go down a creature. You can also sacrifice an Iroas's Blessing. You can sacrifice a creature that's under one of your opponent's auras, like an Ichthyomorphosis. Really just a ton of value in Final Flare, and I've been very, very impressed with it. It's like, it doesn't even have to be in a deck that's dedicated to sacrifice. You're just generally going to be able to get value out of this card. If your opponent is going to try and kill one of your creatures, you can use Final Flare in response. Overall, it's just what the red decks need to kill your opponent's creatures and keep the damage flowing. Okie doke, moving on to green, there's a little bit of movement here. Elysian Caryatid has fallen by the wayside, and Loathsome Chimera has actually taken the top 3 slot from Voracious Typhon. Has moved into the number 2 slot. This was actually a very close decision, and I could see a lot of decks where you'd rather have the Voracious Typhon, but what really pushed this over the edge is that the Loathsome Chimera comes back into the game earlier. It becomes a threat much sooner than the Voracious Typhon, and sure, your escape cards don't necessarily have to be like coming back on turn 5 for them to be scary, but there are some games where you can't bring back the Voracious Typhon because you are constricted on mana, and it becomes a little bit of a bigger issue. Also, the Loathsome Chimera just turn 3, 4-1 hits really hard. Really is just a very potent threat, especially with things like Nessie and Hornbeetle. I think these two are very close, and I could definitely see worlds where Voracious Typhon is better than Loathsome Chimera, but I think Loathsome Chimera is generally going to be exactly where you want to be. Another major benefit of the Loathsome Chimera is it is only 1 green pip, which makes it easier to cast in your red-green decks or your blue-green decks, or really any decks that are not as heavy green. If you have like 8 forests, for example, sometimes you might not be able to cast your Voracious Typhon initially. Also, yeah, escaping for only 5 mana is a huge upside as well. So I think I'm currently at Loathsome Chimera a little bit above Voracious Typhon, especially, yeah, for just all those reasons listed. Also, you feel a little bit less bad if your Loathsome Chimera gets picked off by a Final Death or a Dreadful Apathy. But yeah, those 3 are the top 3 commons for green. Warbriar Blessing isn't going anywhere. It is still a fantastic removal spell. Moving on to the color rankings, these were my initial rankings, and I was actually pretty happy with how I started off. There has been some movement though. I still have black as the best color, and it's actually by a significant amount. There are a lot of very powerful black decks. A lot of the black commons are super powerful. Even the worst black commons are still generally playable, except for Fruit of Tizoris. Poor Fruit of Tizoris. The black is generally just going to be the best color. One side effect of this is that if you are playing at an FNM event or in a format like where you're going to be playing against other competent and experienced players, black is going to be fought over. So sometimes if you open like a medium black card, maybe it's best to segue into a different color instead, so you don't have to fight over the most contested color. White is the second best color. This is based primarily on the power of Dreadful Apathy, Heliod's Pilgrim, a ton of super powerful flyers, good aura interactions, and there being potent white aggressive decks. Green I have as middle of the road. It's very simple to draft. There's good escape creatures at common to give you the power you need to win the late game, and there's also just like a nice big creature package that lets you do pretty simple things. Play your big creatures, kill your opponent. It's going to be a pretty simple, straightforward thing. The blue decks are quite powerful when they come together, but they're a little bit harder to draft, so I have them below green. If you are really good at drafting them, though, I could definitely see blue as moving into the third best color. The blue control decks are very finicky. You need to have all the pieces. You need win conditions, you need control spells like counter spells and card draw, and then you generally need a little bit of removal as well, though you can somewhat rely on counter spells to get the job done in that case. But blue decks are a little bit tricky because you need the exact right concoction, so I think for many drafters, blue is going to be a little bit harder than green to execute upon. And then I have red as the worst color. It's by no means unplayably bad. It's definitely still a potent color. It's just more of a support color generally. You're not going to have as many mono red decks running around, though you definitely can. There are a couple of good red 2-drops to build around. There's some great red removal. There's also some strong sacrifice synergies in red, but I just have it as a little bit worse than the other colors because I think the other colors bring more to the table. Not that red is unplayable or bad. It's just that they're all pretty close. I think it generally is black is pretty far ahead of the other colors. White is pretty decently ahead of the next 3, and then the other 3 are pretty much interchangeable and all pretty good. Moving on to the archetypes, there's been a significant shakeup here. I didn't have like a massive animation for how they changed, but at the top tier I have white-black control as one of the best decks. It just combines a lot of the highest card quality in the set, great removal options, pretty good aura synergies as well if you get those going, and overall just you outvalue your opponent with sheer card quality a lot of the time. Black-red is another deck that really outvalues the opponent. It uses a lot of great removal spells and some sacrifice synergies to get the job done. And even generally there's some escape creatures that are pretty aggressive, so you can end up with some aggressive decks that can still grind into the late game. Green-black I also have as a top tier deck. I've just had a good amount of success with it. It's very consistent. You can get to the late game, win with your escape creatures, and Bob's your uncle. Pretty easy strategy to execute upon. And of course you get access to all of the great black removal. If you notice, 3 black decks are in the top tier because black just has such good cards. And then another final top tier deck is the red-white aggressive deck. There's just a lot of really powerful things you can do, curving out your white aggressive creatures into some heroic, pseudo-heroic cards that care about being targeted, and then you use your white-red Then you use things like Rapid Flames to target a bunch of your stuff, target some of their stuff, making them unable to block, and finish them in one glorious swing. I've definitely found good success with red-white, and I think it is a top-tier archetype. In the middle tier, I have blue-red as the first one to talk about. I think blue-red is actually a very, very, very good deck when it comes together, but it's very finicky on when it comes together. So I have it in the middle tier because it's not the type of deck where you go, oh, I'll take a blue card. Oh, I'll take a red card. Oh, I guess I'm playing blue-red. It's more like, oh, I've got this good payoff for blue-red. I've got this good payoff for blue-red. I've got this good payoff for blue-red. My blue-red deck is really good. But when the draft doesn't come together for blue-red, you kind of end up with a pile of cards that don't do as much together. So I think that it's more middle tier because it's harder to draft. You don't end up in the deck as often. But when you do, it is a top-tier strategy. Definitely very powerful. It cares about casting cards on your opponent's turn. It's a very tempo-y aggro deck, and I think it's very powerful. Blue-black is just a typical control deck. It is going to be very effective when you get the good black removal spells, get the good blue card draw, and combine those together. A lot of the reason's a little bit lower in the standings. I'm realizing now that the colors are a little bit the little color symbols are a little skewed, which is kind of funny, but it's a little bit in the middle tier because you kind of need a powerful late game to win. You need a bomb, or you need some sort of way to stop your opponent from playing their bombs, because if you're in this set, there are a lot of very, very powerful rares, and so if you're planning on going to the late game and you don't have a really good bomb rare, you might just struggle when your opponent plays their Planeswalker and you're just all of a sudden in a bad strait. Blue-green I have as the next mid-tier color combination. It really does rely on some uncommons. Eutropia is a big one for the blue-green deck, and it tries to play a lot of the time as a blue-green kind of tempo-y deck. It can also be a good deck for splashing a lot of other colors as a little bit of a base, but generally going to be a pretty powerful deck if you can get some of the good uncommons or maybe even rares to pay you off for being in blue-green. It kind of plays out as a tempo deck a lot of the time, or sometimes as a big ramp splashy deck. And then finally, in the mid-tier, I have red-green big creatures. It cares about having creatures with 4 power. It's generally going to be pretty effective if you can get some of the payoffs. Nessian Hornbeetle is quite powerful, and so is the Warden of the Chain. Those are the 2 biggest payoffs for this color combination, though I will say Nessian Hornbeetle is just a fantastic magic card on its own, and we'll talk about that later. Low tier, I have blue-white and green-white. Blue-white generally just doesn't come together unless you get Staggering Insight, which is the blue-white gold uncommon, or Dream Trawler. Obviously, if you open Dream Trawler, your deck is going to be great as long as you get suitable playables. Dream Trawler is one of the best rares in the set and will generally carry you to victory when it comes up. I'll be showing the Dream Trawler card later if you don't know exactly what it does, but suffice to say it's among the bombiest bombs in the set. But when you don't get those 2 cards, blue-white can be a little lackluster. And then green-white, I have had success with it in the past, but generally that's when I get very high individual card quality. It's not like a strategy that relies on synergy between the cards, because there's kind of a tension between green-white auras and green-white kind of like go wide stuff, so it's a little bit tricky to know which one you're supposed to be doing sometimes, and both colors, they don't really have a ton of synergy together. So I think green-white can be good, as any of these color combinations can be good, but it just doesn't generally get there on the card quality in the same way that a white-black deck might. Okie doke, biggest movers up. This is a nice category because it's cards that I thought were maybe a little bit worse than they actually have turned out to be. First up, we're going to talk about Thrill of Possibility. This card's much better than it looks, simply because getting cards into your graveyard is very valuable. So instead of just reading as like a card filtering ability, Thrill of Possibility and the card you discard going to your graveyard fuels your next escape spell. So it almost is as if it draws you another card, because most of the escape cards in the set need you to exile 3 cards from your graveyard. So if you count Thrill and the card you discarded, that's already 2/3 of the way there. So Thrill of Possibility gets a nice little bump because of that. Next is Riptide Turtle. A lot of the blue decks want to have cards to cast at instant speed with options, so you want to be able to hold up your Omen of the Sea, your Vexing Gull, your Thirst for Meaning, and your Riptide Turtle. And Riptide Turtle can be flashed in on end of turn, so you can start developing your defenses while you hold up counter spells. Pious Wayfarer is a card that is much better than I thought it was going to be, especially in multiples and combined with flash enchantments. It gets really scary because your opponent makes blocks, and then you can just flash in an enchantment, give a couple creatures +1/+1, and destroy them in combat. It makes blocking very tricky for your opponent, and I think Pious Wayfarer is very good in the white aggressive decks and a high priority. Nessian Hornbeetle, I just wanted to shout out this card because it's so good. Like, it's even better than it looks, essentially. A lot of the time, this card becomes game warping, in that if your opponent doesn't kill it, you can just sit back a couple of turns and kill them with a 7/7 card that you played for 2 mana. Nessian Hornbeetle into Loathsome Chimera is probably the scariest start in the entire format, just because your Hornbeetle then attacks as a 3/3 on turn 3. It's just a very good card, and one you should be taking quite highly. It's the best green uncommon, and a very high pick. Wrap in Flames is another card that gets a little bit better in the context of this set because you can target any creatures, not just your opponents. So you target some of your pseudo-heroic creatures, cards that give your whole team +1/+0 when they're targeted. You target maybe 2 of those and 1 of your opponent's creatures, give your entire team +2/+0, remove a key blocker, and swing in for the win. Sentinel's Eyes is another card that looks much worse than it actually plays out. It ends up being a very effective equipment that also plays with the synergies of the set. It triggers Constellation. The Vigilance can be really relevant, especially on some of the bigger flyers in the set, making it so your opponent can never really attack back in the air. And also just gives you a lot of power, just because it's in your graveyard and it has so much flexibility on what it can be equipped to. Next up, we're going to cover the biggest movers down. Not that these cards are bad by any means, but they performed worse than I expected upon first seeing them. First up, Underworld Charger. I think the not being able to block is actually a very relevant clause. There are certain decks that just don't want to play it as a result of this clause. Some of the black control decks have better things to use their graveyard resources on and will not be looking for an Underworld Charger, even though it just looks like a generically powerful card that can go into any deck. Caliphate, Beloved of the Sea is another card that I think people overvalue. Sure, it's going to be a good card, but in most decks, it's just a glorified 3-mana 3/3. The removal of increased cost for removal is not going to be as potent as the you think it will be. So generally it's just going to be a glorified 3-mana 3/3. Though sometimes I've seen it be like a 3-mana 7/3, and in those cases it can still be terrifying. It's just not as good as like an early pick as some of the other demigods are in the set. Stern Dismissal is also a relatively big disappointment. The fact that it can't bounce your own creature removes a ton of the value that you would normally get from this kind of effect. It's definitely still a card worth playing, definitely still a card that you can play one copy of in your decks, though I have found myself more and more leaving it in the sideboard and waiting for my opponent to present an aura that I can then bounce their creature and get some value out of it. Otherwise, it's just generally not what I want. You can also play it if you have enough card draw to make up for the card disadvantage. Elysian Caryatid is definitely still a good card. I don't want people to think, oh, this card's unplayably bad or anything like that. It's just not a high priority because a lot of the green decks tend to go to the late game. So if you're playing a green-black deck, your Elysian Caryatid isn't really ramping you into anything because you're not trying to beat your opponent down. You're not trying to race to 5 mana to get something on the board. You're generally just trying to stall the game. And then in the late game, your creatures have escape, so you're just going to win the late game board stall by bringing back a 7/7 over and over and over, or a 5/2 over and over and over. And the Elysian Caryatid is not a huge part of that plan. I think its best home is probably in red-green, because that's an aggressive green deck that actually really does care about getting its creatures into play faster, so you're putting your 4/4 into play to beat your opponent down, rather than putting your 4/4 into play to stabilize. Elysian Caryatid, the fact that it doesn't block means it's not as good for the stabilization, and so I think it's a little bit worse than people are giving it credit for, and that's why it's moved out of the top 3 green commons. Hydra's Growth is another card that's a bit of an underperformer. It's just very slow to get going. It definitely works well if you can put it onto a creature that already has a counter on it. If you put on a Nessian Hornbeetle with 3 counters, then that card is just already they're going to become game winning very quickly, but you don't really need that kind of power when you already have creatures with counters. If you put on an escape creature, that's not really your game plan. You're not really, oh, my 5/2 that had a counter on it is now going to be a game-winning threat. You're kind of just going to grind them out anyway, so you don't really need Hydra's Growth. It works better with things like Karametra's Blessing, which you can use to protect the creature you've put Hydra's Growth on, but it's generally a little bit slow and not a card that I prioritize. Now we're going to move on to the bombiest bombs, the best cards in the set. I know people love seeing this kind of section. It's not super relevant for limited because you're going to take these cards when you see them, but these are my 4 picks for bombiest bombs in the set. Shadow Spear gets a mention just because it's colorless and because it's way better than it looks. You shouldn't be passing this card. The lifelink is incredibly relevant, means your opponent can never race, and the trample means that your opponent can't just chump block and sack a creature or something like that. It's still going to get through for the damage. It's going to be pushing through, hitting your opponent, and it's just pretty much, it feels unbeatable in a lot of situations, even though it doesn't look like it will do much. It looks like much more medium than it actually is. Dream Trawler, one of the most fearsome bombs in the set. It's just very hard to beat. When I've lost this card, I think 2 drafts in a row, and I just immediately was like, how do you ever beat this card? There are answers, notably Entrancing Liar. If you use this on your opponent's turn, you can use Entrancing Liar, which is 3 mana for an artifact. You can then pay X and tap it to tap a creature with that power or less. And then you can choose not to untap to keep the creature tapped. If you use that on your opponent's turn, after they've untapped with Dream Trawler, they can either choose to tap the Dream Trawler by giving it hexproof, or they can let the Dream Trawler be tapped, in which case you don't have to worry about it anymore. So it's a way of spending some mana every turn to get rid of the Dream Trawler. Also, Gift of Strength, giving a creature +3/+3 and reach. To block Dreamtrawler is another answer, but Dreamtrawler is one of the most unbeatable cards in the set. It's got evasion, lifelink, card advantage, it's the full package, and really is a reason to play blue-white. If you open it, you should play blue-white pretty much every time. Ashiok Nightmare Muse is another fantastic card. It's even splashable, which is just like an abomination, just like, oh my gosh, how is this card splashable? Pretty much just play it, plus it, your opponent won't ever be able to beat it. Unbelievable card. You can even minus it to just get value that way. But another final card is Kiora Best, the Sea God. I think the only time I beat this card was when I had my opponent at 3 life or something like that when they played it, and then I still had to exile the enchantment after they made the 8/8 and kill them later. Like, it's just a stupidly good card. Very, very powerful. And yeah, pretty much on the card. You make an 8/8, then you tap all of their stuff so you can hit them with the 8/8, and then you steal their best thing. And the game's over. It's just very, very good. Finally, I wanted to briefly mention a 5-color deck possibility. I've seen rumors of this deck. I've tried it once myself. I've seen it in action by watching other people play, discussing it with other people, and I think it is actually a real deck. You essentially get very deep into one color. It doesn't really matter what that color is because there are, as you can see, colorless options to support any color you want to get. And then essentially, say you have primarily a red deck, which was what I did when I had the deck. You have primarily a red deck. You play like 8 mountains, a couple of unknown shores, and then like 1 each or 2 each of the other basic lands. And then you use Traveler's Amulet, Altar of the Pantheon, and Unknown Shores to fix for your other colors. It works very well when you are deep in one color and you're just splashing around for 1 or 2 powerful cards in the other colors. I've definitely seen it have success, and I think it is something to be aware of, though I will say it comes up pretty infrequently. So I just wanted to mention it in the to make sure everybody knew that it was actually kind of a thing that you could do. If you're getting a little bit bored with the format, maybe that's something you can do to spice things up. But I definitely think it can be a real deck, especially if you draft it pretty effectively. So just wanted to make that something to be aware of. That is going to do it for this Draft Guide 2.0. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. Also, leave a hashtag Ready2.0 in the comment section if you did make it all the way till the end. I do love interacting with you folks and seeing which people make it to the end of the video. That is going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.